Bitcoinist just dropped a headline that caught my attention. Ripple becomes Gemini's secret weapon ahead of its IPO. This is honestly a big deal for several reasons. First off, this could have a very real impact on XRP holders, and I'll explain why in a bit. Second, the backstory makes it even more fascinating. If you've been around the crypto space for years, you'll know that Ripple and Gemini haven't exactly been on friendly terms. The Winklevoss twins, or the Winklevi, as some like to call them, who run Gemini, have long had a reputation for being pretty anti-XRP. In fact, Gemini was the only major US crypto exchange that never listed XRP before the SEC lawsuit hit. That's strange, considering XRP was once the second or third biggest crypto by market cap. Even this year, the Winklevoss brothers have made comments that show they're still not entirely sold on XRP. For a lot of Bitcoin purists, anything outside of BTC feels like a betrayal of ideology. To them, XRP, with its large holdings and ties to Ripple, is some kind of sin against decentralization. But that argument doesn't really hold up. Bitcoin has whales too, and XRP's actual network decentralization is what really matters. Quick note before I continue. I'm not a financial advisor. I don't have a background in finance, and nothing I say should be taken as investment advice. I just make these videos because I enjoy following crypto and sharing my thoughts for fun. Now let's dig into what's happening. According to Gemini's freshly filed S1, the exchange secured a revolving credit facility from Ripple Labs as it prepares for its IPO. The filing, submitted to the SEC on August 15, 2025, under Gemini Space Station Inc., outlines a $75 million secured credit line, which could scale up to $150 million depending on certain performance triggers. Here's where it gets interesting. While borrowing above the base commitment is capped in US dollars, Gemini can also request funds in Ripple's new stablecoin, RLUSD, as long as Ripple agrees. The minimum draw is $5 million, and the maximum credit commitment is $150 million. Oh, that's a lot of potential liquidity, and some of it could very well be in RLUSD. Why should XRP investors care? Because RLUSD isn't just another stablecoin. It's built to operate on the XRP ledger, and that means XRP is required to make transactions happen. Whether RLUSD is being used as a stable asset or even as a bridge in payments, XRP is always in the loop because it's the native gas token of the ledger. So, in simple terms, the more RLUSD adoption we see, the more XRP utility grows. Ripple already has the money, talent, and infrastructure to push RLUSD into a major role in the crypto ecosystem, and I think it's only a matter of time before it becomes a serious player. And here's the kicker. Given the frosty history between Ripple and Gemini, this deal really stands out. It shows that whatever differences they had in the past, they've moved past them. Now Gemini is directly embracing Ripple tech, and in doing so, indirectly boosting XRP holders, and I'm not mad about it. In fact, I think it's great to see. On top of that, Gemini confirmed in the filing that it plans to go public on NASDAQ, under the ticker GEMI, with Goldman Sachs and Citigroup leading the IPO. So here's another interesting detail. The funds Ripple is providing Gemini aren't necessarily earmarked for flashy expansion. Instead, they're being directed toward general corporate needs and paying down outside debt. That tells me Gemini wants some breathing room on its balance sheet instead of leaning entirely on equity for growth. And tell me if I'm wrong here, but isn't RLUSD's market cap already sitting around the $600 million mark? Not bad at all, considering the stablecoin has only been live for about 8 months. If Gemini ends up drawing large amounts of RLUSD through this credit facility, that could push demand even higher. Okay, honestly, it just feels like win after win for XRP holders. Now, here's where things take a twist. According to Gemini's S1 filing, the company hasn't exactly been thriving lately. For the first half of 2025, they reported $68.6 million in revenue, but a staggering $282.5 million net loss. Yep, almost a $300 million loss in just 6 months. Not exactly the best numbers to flash before an IPO roadshow. It's a situation. Made me think back to something from years ago. I dug up an old Bitcoinist article from about 7 years back titled, "The Real Reason Why Coinbase and Gemini Won't List XRP." Back then, it was obvious the Winklevoss twins just didn't like XRP, and the reasoning sounded almost identical to what we'd hear from hardcore Bitcoin maximalists. They treated XRP as if it were tainted simply because Ripple held a large portion of the supply, but that never made sense to me. When I got into crypto in 2017, I actually saw Ripple's involvement as a positive. They had every incentive to keep building the ecosystem and making XRP more useful. XRP itself was and is decentralized, so Ripple never had any special control over the ledger. Two people could look at the same facts. One sees a liability, the other sees an advantage. Time has proven the second camp. The XRP holders were right. Now, going back to that old report, it claimed Ripple had been trying, unsuccessfully, to get listed on US exchanges like Coinbase and Gemini. According to insiders, Ripple supposedly offered Gemini a $1 million cash incentive just to list XP and later tried rebates or covering costs to sweeten the deal. At the same time, Ripple allegedly offered Coinbase over $100 million worth of XRP as a loan. Ripple never confirmed these reports, but honestly, I wouldn't be shocked if they were true, and I see nothing shady about it. Paying exchanges to list tokens was a common practice in crypto back then. Project teams knew the exposure from being on big platforms would more than cover the listing fees. Yet, when Ripple supposedly did it, critics painted it as some kind of scandal. Same. Old XRP double standard, and then the biggest laugh. The so-called reason given for keeping XRP off Gemini and Coinbase was that Ripple was centralized. Think about that, not XRP, but Ripple, the company being centralized, was their excuse. Just another example of the twisted logic that came out of the XRP derangement syndrome crowd. Now, here's the part that really makes me laugh. Back then, some people would argue, Ripple is centralized because Ripple is a company. Well, duh, every company is centralized. There's no such thing as a decentralized company. What kind of nonsense is that? And yet the claim kept getting pushed that because Ripple existed, XRP must somehow be centralized and controlled by them. That's just flat out wrong. Bitcoinists and others were pumping out these ridiculous takes, suggesting that XRP was basically a security under US law because Ripple was a company. Pure misinformation. We had to deal with that kind of garbage non-stop back in the day, even though it was never true. The reality, XRP was already decentralized years ago. Sure, Ripple may have been running a handful of validators at the time, maybe 6, 7, or 8, but it was only a fraction of the total network. Since then, Ripple has reduced its footprint even further. I think today they might operate 1 or 2 validators, maybe none at all. So the idea that Ripple somehow controlled XRP was always a made-up narrative, designed to attack the asset. But here's what matters now. Despite that ugly history and all the bogus claims, Ripple and Gemini have clearly found common ground. The credit line deal is mutually beneficial, and it potentially accelerates adoption of RLUSD. And remember, whether or not Gemini borrows directly in RLUSD, there's still good reason to believe it will play a role. That means more transactions flowing through the XRP ledger, which is fantastic news for XRP holders. So after all these years of resistance, it really does look like Gemini has finally come around. Maybe they won't openly admit they were wrong, but their actions speak louder than words. They're embracing Ripple tech, and by extension, acknowledging the utility of XRP. And here's another piece of the puzzle. Earlier this year, one of Gemini's founders openly criticized the idea of including Solana, Cardano, and XRP in a so-called U.S. strategic crypto reserve. You might remember this was back in March when Trump made a post on social media saying XRP, along with Cardano and Solana, should be part of such a reserve. Well, sure enough, Tyler Winklevoss didn't like that one bit. He immediately pushed back, calling it a bad idea. And while he might not label himself a Bitcoin maximalist, let's be real, his attitude fits that mold. It's the same mentality the toxic Bitcoin crowd has had for years, that Bitcoin, despite being technologically outdated, is somehow superior to everything else and should stand above all other cryptos. That mindset has always been there with him. Now, eventually, Gemini did finally come around on XRP. If I'm remembering correctly, they actually launched trading for it in 2024. The timeline went something like this. Right after XRP got legal, clarity, on July 13th, 2023, Gemini announced they were reviewing it for listing. But it wasn't immediate. I think it took about 6 months before they officially brought XRP onto the platform. Here's something that always struck me as odd. Gemini was literally the only US exchange that didn't relist XRP after. The lawsuit ended because you can't relist something you never listed in the first place. They just flat out refused to touch it from day one. That never really made sense. Legally speaking, XRP wasn't any different than a bunch of other assets Gemini was already offering by 2020, but the reality is, they just didn't like XRP. That bias was there from the beginning, so they ignored it. Eventually, though, they did cave and finally listed XRP, and that's what makes today's headline so fascinating. For years, I've talked about how the Winklevoss twins clearly had an anti-XRP stance. Now, here we are in 2025, and suddenly they're willing to work directly with Ripple, using its tech and indirectly supporting XRP in the process. Maybe they're softening. Maybe they've just accepted the reality of XRP's utility. Who knows? But either way, It's undeniably good news for XRP holders. And as always, just to be clear, I'm not a financial advisor. Nothing I say here should be taken as investment advice. This is just me sharing my thoughts as an XRP enthusiast who loves following the crypto space.